Boker Tov, everybody. Nice to see everybody. As always, as we continue to navigate very, very important and very complex times, we daven that our learning today should be a zchut for all of our chatufim, that all of our chatufim should come home, Hashem should protect all of our soldiers. Hashem should bring the chama to all those impacted by this war, and as always, He should give guidance, proper guidance to our leaders to make the right decisions for all of OUisrael. Okay, so we are continuing in our discussion on the overall history and development of Tefilah, and what I wanted to do today was to focus on specifically the text, the text of the Tefilah, where that comes from, where and meaning how the text that as we know it, of Tefilah as we know it today, developed, and try to hopefully through that gain more understanding for why there is a set text and the value of having a set text. Now, as we've mentioned before, our conversation today is going to be focusing on one specific part of the Tefilah, because as we've mentioned, the Tefilah that we have today, the siddur that we have today, the regular Tefilah that we have today is made up of a number of different components. Some of those components are mid-oraisa, or biblical in nature, such as the Shema, or certain psukim that we say at various times throughout the year. What I want to focus on today, which is what Chazal refer to as quintessential Tefilah, is going to be the Shemona Esrei. The Shemona Esrei, when in the Gemara term, when the Gemara refers to what it calls Tefilah, it's referring to Shemona Esrei, because Shemona Esrei is the main quintessential text of the Tefilah. Everything else that we have, generally the Psukei de Zimra, the Shema, Birkot Kriyat Shema, are either meant to be a preparation for Shemona Esrei ultimately, or are separate. As we mentioned before, when we say Shema every morning, that's actually a fulfillment of a separate mitzvah from Tefilah, the fulfillment of Kabbalat O Malchut Shemayim, of accepting upon ourselves the yoke of heaven. And even though it was put together as part of what we call Tefilah, it really is a totally separate mitzvah. And as I mentioned, so today we're going to focus mostly on Shemona Esrei, and use that as a springboard to discuss the concept of having a set Tefilah and why it's important to have a set text. So we're going to start as we often do with our main text. The main text for any conversation on Tefilah is always the Rambam, because the Rambam really, in very, very organized fashion, outlines the development of the Tefilah. And although some of this might be a review, it's important to see the structure as the Rambam develops it. So we're in source number 1. The Rambam outlines initially his opinion, which is his well-known opinion, that Tefilah is biblical, is a mitzvah aseh, is a biblical commandment every single day. Source number 1, section Aleph. Mitzvah aseh lehitpalel b'chol yom, it is a positive commandment every day, to daven every day. Shene'emar, as it says, ve'avadtem et Hashem Elokeichem, the pasuk says, the Torah says, you should serve Hashem. Mipi hashmua, we have a tradition. Thank you. I'm losing my English. We have a tradition that the avodah here is referred to Tefilah. How do we know? Shenamar, as it says in another pasuk, Uli avdo b'chol levavchem, you should serve Hashem with all of your heart. Amru chachamim, the Gemara says in Masechet Ta'anit, Ezo hi avodah shebelev. What is this? Ve'avadatem et ul avdo b'chol levavchem. What does it mean to serve with your heart? What is service of the heart? Zu Tefilah. This is Tefilah. Continues the Rambam. Ve'ein minyan hatfilot min haTorah. Biblically, there is a commandment to daven, but the number of tefillot, as we know, as we've mentioned, is not biblical. Ve'ein mishneh hatfilah, the repetition of the tefillah, the fact that we say it more than once, hazot min haTorah, that's also not min haTorah. Ve'ein letfilah zman kavua min haTorah, and it also has no set time. Okay, much of this we've discussed in the past. Continues the Rambam in source number 2. Ulefikach, therefore, nashim va'avadim chayavim b'tfilah, women and servants and avadim are obligated in Tefilah. Lefi shehi mitzvah aseh shelo hazman grama, because according to the Rambam at least, it is considered to be a mitzvah that is not time-bound. Ella, so then what is the mitzvah, says the Rambam? He says, I'm going to describe to you what is the actual biblical mitzvah. Chiyav mitzvah zu kach, this is what it is. Kachu, excuse me. Sheyehei adam mitchanen umitpalel b'kol yom. That every person needs to pray and daven to Hashem every day. Umagid shivcho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You need to start by praising Hashem. Ve'achar kach shoel tzrakav. And then afterwards, you can ask for what you need. Shehu tzarich lahem bevakasha, to ask with pleading and davening to Hashem. V'achar kach noten shevach v'hodaya laHashem. And then afterwards, you need to end by giving praise and thanks to Hashem. Al hatova shehishpia lo kol echad lefi kocho. Thanking Hashem for all that He has given you. Okay, so although the Rambam doesn't outline a specific text, he does outline a specific order of how this tefillah needs to go. Okay, he says it can be personal. Everyone can do it in their own way, but it needs to follow a certain structure. And that structure is you start with praise, you then go to asking, bakasha, and you end with hoda'ah, hodaya. And as many of us, as we mentioned a number of times, this is the basic structure of Shmona Esrei as we know it. Shmona Esrei, which used to have 18 brachot, now has 19 brachot. Hopefully we'll get to that at some point, Be'ezrat Hashem. It starts with 3 brachot that are what we would call shevach, praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then it has the main part would be the middle section, which is really 13 brachot, where we're asking Hashem for all the things that we want that we're davening for, and then we end with hodaya, we're thanking Hashem for everything that He has done for us. Yes.
It's always bothered me is why is the shalom at the end where we're basically thanking Hashem for what He's done for us. Should it be a bakasha?
So it's a very, very, very good question. It's a very good question. You're asking specifically about the bracha of Sim Shalom. Why is Sim Shalom considered to be a hodaya as opposed to a bakasha? So I can't tell you for sure, but my initial reaction would be, and again, it would really involve going through the bracha itself. But I think if we go through the bracha itself, it's not just a bakasha. It's also meaning the length of that bracha. Most brachos that are bakashot are relatively quick and short. It's really, I want this, please give me this. A couple of lines. Maybe Yerushalayim Yircha is a little bit longer. But Shalom, the length of it implies that it's not just, and again, it requires sitting down and going through the actual text itself. It is a bakasha, but it's also a sense of thanking Hashem for what He has given us and then asking that we should continue with that. But it requires a little more analysis. It's a very good question. Okay. So now the question is, where did the Rambam get this from? Meaning, on some level, it's logical. As we've talked about before. In interpersonal relationships, if you would like something from somebody, you don't just run to them and you say, please give me, your car, or please give me some money. You go up to them and you say, you're a really great person. You're very special. I really appreciate you. By the way, I could use X, Y, and Z, right? Some of this is just logical. Even though obviously HaKadosh Baruch Hu is different, it's not just about trying to get something from Hashem. It's about us learning proper etiquette and proper approach to interpersonal and all kinds of relationships. So we could just argue this is logic, that the Rambam got this from logic. But the truth is that there actually is a Gemara that initially talks about this. The Rambam got this from the Gemara. If you look at source number 2, we'll get back to the rest of the Rambam. But if you now go to source number 2, the Gemara Mesechet Brachot already discusses the need to open up your tefillah with what he calls shevach. Darash Rabbi Simlai, source number 2. Le'olam yisader adam shivcho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A person should first begin with praise. Ve'achar kach yitpalel, and then he should daven. Minalan, how do I know? What's the source for this? So the Gemara says, Mi Moshe, from Moshe Rabbeinu Dichtiv, because in the beginning of Parshat Ve'et Chanan, Moshe explains his tefillah to Hashem to allow him to enter Eretz Yisrael. It says, Ve'et Chanan el Hashem, ba'itahi, I davened to Hashem, I pleaded with Hashem. And how does it start? Uchtiv, Hashem Elokim, ata hachilota leharot et avdecha, et godlecha ve'et elchaz achazaka. How does Moshe open up his request? He doesn't just go straight to, hey Hashem, please let me go into Eretz Yisrael. He says, you began to show me all your greatness and your strong hand. Asher mi el b'shamayim u'v'aretz. There is no God like Hashem. Asher yasechem ma'asecha v'chik v'rasecha, who has done so much and has so much strength. And then afterwards it says, Ebrana ve'eret ha'yarden hazeh. Please Hashem, let me enter Eretz Yisrael. So Moshe, already in probably one of the most powerful tefillot that we have in the Torah, Moshe begins with thanking Hashem or praise of Hashem and Hashem's strength, and then goes into the request. So says the Gemara, we learn from here that a person needs to, whenever they're going to daven, the proper way to daven is to begin with praise and then continue with bakasha. And so the Rambam, based on this Gemara, establishes that when we talk about the biblical commandment to daven, our daily tefillah should follow this same structure. It should begin with praise. It should again continue with the bakasha. And again, the Gemara here doesn't discuss ending with hoda'ah, but that there's also much logic to that again, you begin and end with something different than just, I want, or please give me. You really begin with a relationship, then you get to what you want, and then you end closing with that relationship as well. And so the Rambam has taken this Gemara and turned it into not just a recommendation, but really the definition and the structure of our daily tefillah. Good question? Sorry. Absolutely, thank you. Yes, yeah. I mean, of course, and I would say it even more than that. I would say that even more than that. Yes, I mean, and I think that's true. It's a very good point. Correct. Meaning, she said she would think that the praise is really not for Hashem, but it's really for us to understand and to recognize Hakadosh Baruch Hu. And that's true of most of our tefillah, as we've talked about before. In the end of the day, the tefillah isn't as much for Hakadosh Baruch Hu as it is for us to learn lessons and to understand how to relate to Hakadosh Baruch Hu. So I agree with you. It's about understanding that this is, number one, it's about appreciating what Hashem has done for us. Although you could argue that if that was the purpose, we could really mention it at any point during the tefillah. But it's also about us understanding that this is how a person should approach these kinds of opportunities, beginning in a certain structure. But you're 100% correct. Yes.
I was going to say something else. First, I think that we have to know who we're asking. If we're
also
not
true.
Asking the janitor to,
also true. Correct. Yes, that's also a fair point. Meaning part of what we're doing when we're praising Hashem is it's reminding us who we're talking to, that He is the source of all that we have, and therefore it's appropriate for us to turn to Him. Correct. True.
So I was thinking this might be a paradigm for, we've got to daven every day.
Yeah, that's a beautiful idea. Correct. It's fascinating that the source for how our tefillah should work is from Moshe Rabbeinu, who ultimately he was not granted this specific request. And perhaps that's also a message for us, which is that we daven and we approach davening appropriately, and we hope that our tefillah will be answered in the way that we view them to be answered. But sometimes that doesn't always occur. And that example is very, very powerful. Correct. Okay, one more question before we go on, or comment. Absolutely. Correct. Absolutely. Exactly. He's saying that this is also a lesson in interpersonal relationships, as I mentioned, meaning this isn't just about how to talk to Hashem, it's how to talk to anybody. Anybody that you are talking to, requesting from, you should also begin with something positive. That's just the way, that's the most effective, but it's also the most appropriate. 100%. Much of tefillah and the way tefillah is patterned is also meant to be a source for our understanding how we're supposed to speak, to others. Okay, so that's one piece. Now let's go back to the Rambam. The Rambam, continuing in source number 1, he now continues to discuss the development of tefillah as we know it. We're in Gimel now. Source number 1, section Gimel. So everybody has to have these 3 elements. Has to have shevach, bakasha, and then hodaya. How did it usually work in the past? In section number 3. Im haya ragil, marbe b'tachana ubakasha. If this was somebody for whom speaking was something that was normal and appropriate. He was a talkative type of person, someone who liked to speak. So when they would daven to Hashem, they would say a lot. They would be marbeh, they would say a lot of tachana, of davening, and of requests. V'imaya aral svatayim, if they were somebody who had trouble speaking, aral svatayim is reference to Moshe Rabbeinu, who also was somebody who could not speak, whether it's a physical impediment or even an emotional impediment, somebody who was not talkative, not necessarily someone who was comfortable speaking. So then they would speak a little bit, midaber kefi yicholto, then every person used to basically say as much as they wanted, whenever they wanted. V'chein minyan hatfilot kol echad yefi yecholto. Jewish history, the way it worked was, how many times a day did you daven? As much as you wanted to. That was what it used to be based on the biblical nature of the mitzvah. Yesh mitpalel pam achat bayom. There were some who would daven only once a day. V'yesh mitpalelim pamim arbeh. And then there were some who would daven lots of times, depending on what they felt and what they wanted. Hakol yiyu mitpalalin nochach hamikdash b'kol makom sheyeh. And then the Rambam adds that one of the key parts was that whenever a person would daven, he would always daven facing where? Facing Yerushalayim. Okay, that's something hopefully we'll speak about as well. Why we all need to face Yerushalayim. I mean, there's something very logical about it, but there's a lot of significance to that. By the way, it's a little bit interesting. You ask a lot of people who come from America, and you ask them when they're in Israel, which way am I supposed to face? They always say east. Not 100% correct. If you're in America, you should always face east. If you're in Eretz Yisrael, you should face Yerushalayim. Wherever, even if Yerushalayim is west or north or south, you face Yerushalayim. But we're used to saying east. but it means you're always supposed to face Yerushalayim. Okay, so says the Rambam, everyone needed to face Yerushalayim. V'chein hayar David tamid Moshe Rabbeinu ad Ezra. And this is the way it was all the way from Moshe Rabbeinu up until the times of Ezra. Tefilah was biblical once a day. It needed to include the structure that we discussed, but everybody did it in their own way and whenever they wanted. Then says the Rambam, something changed. What changed? What changed was the Galut, the first exile after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. Kevan shegalu Yisrael b'mei Nebuchadnezzar harasha. Once OUisrael went into exile as a result of the attack of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bavel, nitarvu biparas v'yavan. All of a sudden, all the Jews were exiled, and they started now being spread out across different countries: Persia, Greece, Usha'ar, Omod, and other nations. V'noldu lahem banim be'artzot hagayim. They started to have children and grandchildren. They started to now continue to grow communities. In Chutz Laretz. Ve'otam habanim nitbalbilu sfatam. What happened was their Hebrew began to decay a little bit. They started to now speak the language of where they were, whether they were in Greece or they were in Persia or wherever, or they were in Babylonia, wherever they were. Their understanding and the depth of their Hebrew knowledge began to erode. V'hayta sfat kol echad ve'echad mi'urevet mileshonot harbe. And now whatever English they had, whatever Hebrew they had, used to. There you go, exactly. Case in point, whatever Hebrew they had began to get mixed up with the local language, right? I'm not someone who's well versed in Yiddish, but from what I understand, Yiddish is basically a combination of Hebrew and German and all these different and Aramaic in there. You have all these different languages. That's a classic example of a result of galut, of exile. It's interesting now that most people identify that more than anything else with Yadus. And with like the Mama Lashon, but it on some level Yiddish is a symbol of exile because it's the Hebrew mixed in with all the other languages. V'kevan shaya medaber eno yochol ledaber kol tzarko beloshon achat ela b'shibush. What happened was people had trouble expressing themselves in the proper Hebrew language because they were just mixing up all the different languages. I'm thinking about it myself as I'm saying this. I'm thinking about my own children who have grown up with American parents who speak to them in English, but also grew up. They've all been born here in Eretz Yisrael, so they all know here. They're all fluent in Hebrew. And sometimes, especially my youngest is now 3. He'll sometimes mix in both of them together, Hebrish. Where he'll be like in one sentence he'll be like half Hebrew, half English. And that's Baruch Hashem, that's here in Eretz Yisrael. But that's a symbol of somebody being not in their natural habitat. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, "Ubneihem chatzi medaber ashdodit." Some people would speak this, and other people would speak that. Ve'enam makirim ledaber Yehudit ukilashon am va'am. They weren't able to speak fully Hebrew. Rather, they were speaking in the language of where they were. Umipnei zeh, says the Rambam. Now, what was the result of all of this? Kishaya echad mehen mitpalel. Whenever somebody in Galut would daven, Tikatzer lishono lishol chefatzav ola hagid shavach hakadosh baruch hu. He would speak in very, very short terms because he didn't feel comfortable expressing himself in Hebrew. He didn't feel like he knew Lashon HaKodesh. They weren't as educated, and therefore they had trouble expressing themselves. So Tefilah became very short and very curt. It's a good question. He does refer to Lashon Yehudin and later refers to Lashon HaKodesh. I'm not sure. I think here he's referring to the same thing. But I'm not sure. But I'm not 100% sure. It's a good question. I don't know. Meaning you are correct that before he was referring to it as Daber Yehudit, that I understood to be was he was referring to Hebrew, and then later on he refers to Lashon HaKodesh. So I'm not 100% sure, but it's a good question. It's a good question.
Once watching a video of the Chalitza, the Dayan asked the woman who speaks Ifrit or
Lashon HaKodesh. Also true, right? So I don't know if he's meaning. I think what you're referencing is the fact that you have something called modern Hebrew, and then you have something called Lashon HaKodesh, which is biblical Hebrew versus modern Hebrew. I don't think he's referring to that per se, the Rambam, because I don't know how different back then. I don't know if there was something called modern Hebrew that was that different from the biblical Hebrew back then. So I don't know exactly what he's referring to when he says Yehudit here. I do believe he's referring to the Jewish Lashon HaKodesh, but I could be wrong. But it's a good question. Yes, there is certainly today. There's a big difference between what we would call modern day Hebrew and Lashon HaKodesh. I'm sorry?
The Yiddish. The Jews were in Europe.
Yes.
But that was like
Exactly, correct. Yiddish is it was basically Hebrew mixed in with the local dialect.
Okay.
How did it develop? I can't say. Meaning,
It was 13th century German, and while in Germany, German developed in the Jewish communities, which are often Poland and who knows where, it did not
did
develop.
not develop.
So it remained the 13th century kind of German.
Interesting. And
And
then
it
slowly
mixed
got
with
mixed in.
the Hebrew.
So you had basically they kept to the English. They didn't fully immerse, but then slowly it seeped in. I don't know enough about Yiddish, but that's meaning it's clear that that's a classic example of when things get mixed up. So says the Rambam. What's the result here? What the result here was that v'kevan shira'a Ezra ubeit dinokach. Ezra realized that what was the result here? This is what's important for us. People weren't davening. People weren't davening, or they were davening very, very quickly because they couldn't express themselves in the appropriate language that they were meant to. So what did they do? So what did Ezra do? Ezra ubeit dino, Ezra and his beit din, amdu v'tiknu lahem shmona asar brachot ala seder. They established something that we know as the Shmona Esrei, 18 brachot in order. Shalosh rishonot shevach laHashem. The first three are praise. Shalosh achronot hodaya. The next three are hodaya, are thanks. Ve'emtsayot, and the middle ones yesh bahem she'elat kol hadvarim she. Then that's where you request everything. Shehein kimo avot lekol cheftzei ish ve'ish. They are like the main categories. Avot here doesn't mean forefathers. Avot means like the main categories of what a person should be davening. We'll get to this soon. But basically, they picked the 13 major categories that they thought we should all be davening for.
So that's like the precursor of Anshe Knesset.
So actually, according to what we're going to see, that is the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. This, we're actually, the Rambam doesn't refer to them as Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, but we're going to see the Gemara does. So yes, this is the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Very good. Okay? They did this as a set text so that the text would be so that everyone would be able to be aware and understand the text. Yesh bahem, B'fi hakol v'lam duotam v'tiyet tfilat elu ha'algim. Alagim seems to refer to people who are not eloquent, people who had trouble speaking, in order to ensure that those who had trouble speaking would be able to pray and daven as much as those who were more eloquent. And they were able to daven a tfilah shlema, a complete tfilah, kitfilat ba'alei alashon hatzacha, as good as people who were eloquent. Mipnei inyan zeh tiknu kol habrachot utfilot misudarot b'fi kol Yisrael kidei sheyeh inyan kol bracha aruch b'fi ha'alag. In order to make sure that every single person, every single member of the Jewish people could feel comfortable davening in front of a Kadosh Baruch Hu and feel as comfortable as people who are more eloquent in their language. That is why Ezra and his Beit Din established what we know as the Shmona Esrei. Now, of course, the Rambam here, again, he doesn't mention Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, but the question becomes, where does the Rambam get this from? It's clear as well that the Rambam got this entire thing from the Gemara as well. If you look at source number 3, the Gemara refers to them as Anshe Knesset HaGedolah and not as Ezra Ubeit Din. But all indications are that they are this one and the same. Source number 3 is a Gemara Masechet Brachot, much shorter than the Rambam. The Rambam definitely adds to the development, but the Gemara says something very simple. Itmar Nami, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, Tiknu lahem liYisrael, Brachot, Utfilot, Kiddoshot, V'havdalot. Anshe Knesset HaGedolah established the following things. They established the concept of brachot. We're not going to spend time on that. Which brachot are they referring to? We're not going to spend time on that now. Tfilot, which we're going to see soon in another source, seems to be referring specifically to Shmona Esrei. Kiddushot, which seems to be referring to Kiddush, the mitzvah of Kiddush, and Havdalah, the texts of Kiddush and the text of Havdalah. Okay, so we see very clearly this is Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. The Rambam doesn't refer to them as Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, but he refers to them as Ezra and his Beit Din. And that seems to be one of the same as we're going to see. Just a couple more minutes. I want to just get through some of these sources. The Gemara Masechet Megillah also mentions this as well. Tefillah minalan. Where does tefillah come from? Asked the Gemara Masechet Megillah. Detanya. We learn in a Braita. Shimon hapekoli hisdir Shimona esrei brachot lifnei Rabbi Gamliel al haseder biyavne. Someone by the name of Shimon hapekoli. He established 18 brachot, and he established this in front of Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel was the Reish Galuta, was the head rabbi in Yavne. And at that point, and Shema by the name of Shimon HaPekuli established the Shmona Esrei. Asked the Gemara, or not, doesn't ask, first the Gemara just comments. Amar Rabbi Yochanan v'amri la b'masni satana. We have another statement where it says, Mea ve'esrim zekenim, 120 elders, uvahem kama nivi'im, and included in that 120 were many, many prophets. Tiknu shmona esrei brachot ala seder. They were the ones who established shmona esrei to be in a specific order. And the Gemara then goes on to show how each bracha, we're not going to spend too much time on this now, how each bracha, actually the exact order is a reference to certain psukim in Tehillim. Because as the Gemara says right now, Tanu Rabbanan minayin she'omrim avot. How do we know that we're supposed to say the brachot of avot? As the pasuk says in Tehillim, Havu Hashem b'nei elim. Uminayim she'omrim gvurot. And how do we know that we're supposed to talk about gvurot hagshamim, which is the next bracha? Shene'emar Havu Hashem kavod va'oz. These are psukim in order. And many of us are familiar with this from Kabbalat Shabbat in Pirkei Tehillim. And the Gemara goes on to show how all of Shmona Esrei, the order itself, actually corresponds to various psukim in the Tehillim. Now, that's something that hopefully we'll get to when we get to the specifics of the Shmona Esrei brachot themselves. But what we see here, at least right now, is another understanding of who are these Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. We have the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah was discussed, they were mentioned earlier. Then we said that there are now 120 rabbis. Included in that group is many Nevi'im. From the Rambam, we know that this is somebody who was headed by Ezra and his Beitin. So we're getting a fuller picture as to exactly who this group was. But then the Gemara says, wait a second. If you told me that the rabbis are the ones who did it, so what did Shimon do? Look at the second part of section number 4. If you're telling me that 120 elders, umehem kama nevi'im, and some of them are nevi'im, tiknu Tefilah ala seder. They're the ones who set up the Tefilah. Shimon hapakuli ma hisdir. Then what did he do? The rabbis are the ones who set it up. So what exactly did this Shimon? What did he add if it was already established? Answers the Gemara. Shachachum v'chazar v'sidrum. What happened was at some point in the process, these brachot were forgotten, even though had been established by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Comes Shimon and he reestablished them. Now, that answer of the Gemara is a little bit challenging. Some of the Rishonim say, wait a second, but if this is something that is now being said every single day by all of the Jewish people, how exactly would they forget it? So some say that that the order was forgotten, and then Shimon reestablished the order. Okay, but the point here is at the very, very end, what we see very clearly is that the source for our Shmona Esrei, and the text for Shmona Esrei, is from the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, who we know are 120 elders who were gathered by Ezra, and included in them many Nevi'im. Yes?
The purpose of making it written there, putting it down, because the feeling that the people will lose their ability to do the Hebrew to really do it. How did the Anshe deal with the fact that the people might not understand what they're reading?
Excellent question. The question that was asked was, if the reason that it was established, as we saw in the Rambam, was because people were not able to express themselves appropriately, then what about the challenge, which certainly we can see, was based on the fact that people might now not understand what they're reading? It's a great question. I want to hold that to the side. We're going to we will get to that. It's a very good question. It's an important question, but I want to hold off on that first because I want to first finish just discussing the development, and then we'll get to that question. It's a very important question. Okay, so what I want to just do is take a minute to understand once again. We've talked about the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. We have this concept called the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. They're the ones who established who exactly are the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. We know that there are 120 rabbis. We know that there's Ezra that's involved in them. I'd like to just first look at a couple of sources that kind of outline exactly who we're referring to so that we can better understand who it is that established the text as we know. We're going to skip to source number 6. The Rambam, in his introduction to Perush HaMishnayos, has a very, very well-known description of the development of the oral law. And in it, he goes through a history of how things were passed down, and included in that, he discusses specifically the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah and their introduction to Shmona Esrei. So we're in source number 6. Says the Rambam the following: Kasher meit Yehoshua, when Yehoshua passed away, Yehoshua ben Nun, alav shalom, lamad lazikenim mashe kibel min hapirush. He then passed down what he had been given, and he gave that to the Zikanim, the 70 elders. And he also included in that any new additions that each generation developed. V'lo nafal alav machlok. At that point, says the Rambam, there was no such thing as machloket, because so far it was just, again, we're not going to get into too much of this detail, but basically what happened was, this was passed down from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe. Moshe passed it down to Yoshua. Yoshua to the Zekanim. This may sound familiar if you've ever learned the introduction to Pirkei Avot. Okay? And then, so says the Rambam, at that point, there was no machloket yet. This was just basically the Mesorah being passed down from one to the next. V'asher nafal bo machloket. Anytime there was any kind of disagreement, what did they do? Pasko bo hadin al pi rov azikenim. Then what did they do? Then they went by the majority. Achrei rabim lahatot. Ve'aleim amar hakatuv. V'kol yemei hazikenim asher harichu yamim achrei Yoshua. And that's why the pasuk in Yoshua refers to the Zekanim who continued to live after Yoshua passed away. Ve'achar kain lamdu hazikenim hahem mashi kiblu mipi Yoshua. The Zekanim then took what they learned. El HaNevi'im, they taught it to the Nevi'im. Aleim HaShalom v'HaNevi'im lamdu zeh lazeh. And then the Nevi'im, the prophets, would pass it down from one to the next. Continues the Rambam, Ve'ein zman shelo haya bo hitbonenut v'chidush ha'inyanim. Says the Rambam, don't think that this was all just a matter of passing down from one to the next. There was always going to be what we would call chidush, new ideas, new questions, new applications. Every generation was always going to have new scenarios that were going to be raised. V'hayu chachmei kol hador. What would the chachamim of each generation do? They would misimim divrei hakodmim ikar. They would first take in the Mesorah from previous generations. And then they not only would they learn what the previous generation had taught them, they would then also, based on that, establish new laws, new takanot, new decrees, depending on what the generation needed. But the main things that were passed down, there was no machlokes. Ad higia hazman la'anshe knesset hagedola. Then we got, says the Rambam, eventually to the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Who are the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah? Vehem, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishal, Ve'azariah, Ve'ezra HaSofer. He's naming some of them. These are many of the well-known Nevi'im, as well as personalities from Nevi'im Achronim. Included them was Ezra HaSofer, Ve'nechemya ben Chachalya, Mordechai, Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel. These are the people that led the return from Bavel after the destruction in anticipation of rebuilding the second Beit HaMikdash. Vilnilvu la'ela haniviim hashlamat me'ah ve'esrim zaken min hacharash v'hamasger v'domehem v'hidbananu gamhem. So what happened was Ezra, as he's now coming back from Bavel to rebuild the second Beit HaMikdash, he now brings with him all of the Nevi'im, the last few Nevi'im that were in OUisrael, and the great Talmidei Chachamim, and he establishes something called the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, 120 great leaders. And these people, what did they do? They looked around, they understood the needs of the generation, V'gazru gezerot v'tiknu takanot, and they established new decrees and new gezerot based on the needs of the generation. Who was the last one? The last member of this Anshe Knesset HaGedolah was Shimon HaTzadik, who we know was also, again, the continuation of Pirkei Avot. Shimon HaTzadik was the last of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah to pass things down from generation to generation. So who are the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah? They were a group of prophets and Talmidei Chachamim who were gathered towards the end of the first Galut with the creation and the rebuilding of the second Beit HaMikdash. Ezra and this group realized that there were certain needs of the generation, and they established a number of different things, among which we know includes Tefilah. If you look at source number 7, the Perush in the Kahati. The Kahati is a well-known Perush on the Mishnah. He summarizes this for us in a very good way. Knesset HaGedolah Haita Moetzet Nevi'im v'Chachamim. It was a gathering of Nevi'im v'Chachamim shenosda al yedei Ezra HaSofer ba'asifah, that Ezra HaSofer gathered together. Shekines b'Yerushalayim ba'aloto miBavel, that he gathered them in Yerushalayim when he came back from Bavel. V'zu tikna takanot gidolot v'chashuvot l'chizuk haTorah ve'emunah. And they established many important new takanot in order to strengthen the learning of Torah and emunah. Bein Rishonei Anshe Knesset HaGedolah hayu Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi. Tkufatam nimshicha kimatayim shana ad Shimon HaTzadik shaya achron shelahem. And it lasted for a couple of 100 years until Shimon HaTzadik. Yes? That's a good question. I think, again, the understanding was that Mordechai was involved in I mean, again, this is more of a historical question that I'm not 100% clear on, but it seems that Mordechai was a part of this, but then eventually returned back to Paras, meaning he was amongst the people that kept going back. If you look, it's very interesting. If you look at the very beginning of the Megillah, and the pasuk says, "Asher agla Yerushalayim im hagala asher aglisa." So Rashi there quotes the midrash that says that Mordechai kept going back and forth, that he was exiled a number of times. Why does it repeat Asher hagla Asher? Because Mordechai kept going back to Yerushalayim, and then he was exiled, and then he went back, and he kept trying to go back and forth. So it seems like Mordechai was a personality who was, on the one hand, very involved in the return, but also at the same time, also very much a part of the community in Paras. Yes, correct. According to the Midrash, he was Asach. Yeah, so it seems like, the players are all, again, we sometimes see these things as linear because we see them as separate Sfarim, but very often many of the Sfarim there's a lot of interplay between the different ones. Yes. Well, again, we're talking about a large time. I think when initially the list that we have is they were all living at the same time, but then this Anshe Knesset HaGedolah continued for a couple of hundred years. So it must be that as people passed away, they brought new people in, because we are talking about a time that spanned over a large amount of time. Okay, so now that we understand that, the reason why it's important to understand this is because when we talk about the text, we're not just talking about some rabbi that got up and wrote a text. We're talking about the Gedolei Yisrael. Included within them are the Nevi'im, led by Ezra, who was one of the leaders at the time of the Jewish people, that realized there were a number of things that needed to be established, and one of those was the development of Tefilah. Now, one of the questions that comes up when we ask when we talk about the establishment of the text is, okay, well, what does that mean? We mentioned that they established the text of Shemona Esrei. Does that mean that none of this existed, that none of the brachot existed until they came around? So there's actually an interesting range. The Rambam seems to suggest that, yes, correct, that until Ezra came around, the entire text of the Shemona Esrei, at least the way he seemed to describe it, there was no text. Everybody said what they wanted, and comes Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, and they establish the full 18 brachot, and then later on a 19th bracha was added. Until that point, these brachot did not exist. That seems to be the simple understanding of the Rambam. I don't know the exact year, but it's later on in the times of the Gemara mentions its addition, but I don't remember exactly when. But in fact, if you go back and you look at source number 5, we're not going to see it inside, just for time purposes, but I'll just to. This is a Tshuvat HaGeonim. You do have a source that seems to indicate that even in the times of the first Beit HaMikdash, some of these brachot, it did exist. This source number 5, they suggest that the first bracha of Avot and the bracha of Gvurot and Atah Kadosh actually did exist in the times of the first Beit HaMikdash, and only later on were the rest of the brachot added on. So you do have a machlokes historically, whether all of Shemona Esrei was established by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, or whether some of it had already started to be said earlier, and it was only kind of formalized and brought together by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. One interesting source regarding on this opinion on this issue that I saw only last night after I had sent in the source sheets, the Shibbolei Haleket, who's one of the Rishonim on the Gemara, he actually suggests that none of the Shemona Esrei brachot were created by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, and that they all were developed over Jewish history. And it's fascinating. He suggests that when was the bracha of Magen Avram instituted? When Avram was saved from the furnace if we go all the way back to the story, we know the Medrash that tells us that Avram was saved from the furnace. That was when Magen Avram was developed. And he says, when was Mechaya Yamesim developed? When Yitzchak was saved at the Akedah. And then what he says is that all of the brachot really are symbols of various points in Jewish history. And at all those points in Jewish history, that's when those brachot were actually created. And then what Anshe Knesset HaGedolah did was they actually just collated it all and established it as a set text for all of Am Yisrael. Now, that's a very fascinating opinion. Whether that's actually what we believe that actually happened, or what it is highlighting, which maybe as a medrash it could be highlighting, is that the brachot really just symbolize the totality of Jewish history, I think is an interesting question. But it's a beautiful approach. But what we see is there's a whole range of opinions regarding exactly what Anshe Knesset HaGedolah established. But what's clear is that they formalized it all. They formalized the text, at least according to the mainstream opinion. They formalized most of the text, at least according to the main opinion. And if they didn't formalize all of it, they definitely created it as to be the way it is right now. Now, why did Chazal do this? So we saw that according to the Rambam gives one answer. The Rambam suggested the reason why Chazal established this was because Am Yisrael, as a result of Galut, were no longer able to express themselves. They were no longer able to properly daven. And in order to ensure that the continuation of Tefilah throughout the generations, we can even suggest perhaps as they anticipated Am Yisrael once again returning to Galut, and therefore this idea that they're now going to need to stay connected even in exile. Perhaps what they established was to have a set text to ensure that every single day, every single Jew would daven. That's a good question. I'm not sure about those. I think those were established separately. And obviously we know, as we know, the question was, what about the Shemon Esrei of the Chagim and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? So certainly the first three and the last three are the same. Meaning, when every Shemon Esrei has the same. We do know that, for example, Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara talks about the various texts. I assume it was similar in Rosh Hashanah. Whether that was a result of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah or just kind of Chazal over the years establishing that, I'm not 100% sure. It's a good question. Okay, what I'd like to share with you is a couple of other approaches to why exactly Chazal did this. The Rambam's approach was one approach. Rambam's approach was that as a result of Galus, therefore Am Yisrael were no longer able to properly express themselves, and therefore what resulted was a set text to ensure that they would continue to daven. If you look at source number 8, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, I think we even saw some of this in an earlier shir, but it really is a beautiful piece where he outlines the history of Tefilah as we know it, and in particular focuses on the history of the text of Tefilah. He opens up by basically contrasting two different modes of worship. What he calls Tefilah, and the other one he calls Korbanot. And he notes that whereas throughout Jewish history, Korbanot were very, very rigid. You had to bring this korban in this way, had very specific halachot. Tefillot were specifically not rigid, for the reason we mentioned before, because we wanted to make sure that people were going to express themselves appropriately. And therefore, what did tefillah consist of throughout Jewish history? Basically, a person said what they wanted to, when they wanted to, because we wanted it to be with hergesh, with feeling. And that was tefillah. Tefillah was basically spontaneous in any way that a person wanted, whereas you had korbanot, which were much more rigid. Over time, suggests Rabbi Sachs, what happened was Tefilah and Korbanot combined with each other, and therefore the Tefilah that we knew as spontaneous adopted the rigidity of Korbanot. Look at source number 8. Throughout the Bible, we find two different forms of religious worship. One is prayer. Outside the book of Psalms, there are some 140 references to people praying. In 97 cases, we are told the words they said. Avram prays for the cities of Sodom and Amorah. Jacob prays for deliverance before confronting Esav. Hannah prays for a child. These prayers are direct, simple, and spontaneous. They have no fixed formula, no set text. There are no general rules. These prayers have no fixed time, place, or liturgy. They are improvised as circumstance demands. The other form, generally known as avodah, service, is sacrifice. Sacrifice cannot be less like prayer. As set out from Exodus to Deuteronomy, the sacrificial service is minutely specified. It has its prescribed order, which offerings can be made, when, and by whom. It has a designated place, the tabernacle, the Mishkan in the wilderness, and later the temple in Jerusalem. There is no room for spontaneity. When two of Aaron's sons die, not of an Avihu make a spontaneous offering of incense, they die. Certain sacrifices, such as sin offerings, involve verbal confession. Psalms were sung in the temple, and the Mishnah details the prayer said there. But the sacrificial act itself was wordless. It took place in silence. So we have two quite different traditions, prayer and sacrifice. One spontaneous, the other rigorously legislated. One that could be undertaken anywhere at any time by anyone. The other which could only happen in a set place and time in accordance with detailed and inflexible procedures. How did these two forms of worship become one? The answer lies in the national crisis and renewal that occurred after the destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE. In exile in Babylon, Jews began to gather to expound the Torah, articulate a collective hope of return, and recall the temple and its service. So you see what Rabbi Sachs is suggesting is that Tefilah as a set text began already in Golus. It didn't begin specifically with Ezra upon the return after the first exile. It actually began in exile. Because how did the Jews relate to the lack of Beit HaMikdash? They can no longer go to the Beit HaMikdash. They would create Batei Knesiot, which literally means houses of gathering, houses of where they would come together, and they would begin to pray, and therefore the beginning of a set text began. In exile, began to expound the Torah, articulate a collective hope of return, and recall the temple. These assemblies were not substitutes for the temple, rather they were reminders of it. The loss of the temple and the experience of exile led to the emergence of regular gatherings for study and prayer. The next chapter in this story was written by Ezra, who, together with the statesman Nehemiah, reorganized Jewish life in Israel after the return of from Babylon. Ezra and Nehemiah were disturbed by the high degree of assimilation among the Jews who had remained in Israel. They knew that without a strong religious identity, the people would eventually disappear through intermingling with other nations and cultures. To guard against this, they set in motion far-reaching initiatives, including the national reaffirmation of the nation's covenant with God. One of the most important developments was the first formulation of prayers, attributed by the sages to Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly. And so the result, the idea of having a set text was both began in Galut. As they returned to Galut, there was this awareness we need to change things around a little bit, and that's where the text began. So it's a little bit different, a bit of a variation from the way the Rambam describes it. Continues Rabbi Sachs. The transition from sacrifice to prayer was not a sudden development. 1,000 years earlier, in his speech at the dedication of the temple, King Solomon had emphasized prayer rather than sacrifice. Through Isaiah, God had said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all people." Sacrifice was the external accompaniment of an inner act of heart and mind, thanksgiving, atonement, and so on. Therefore, though the outer act was no longer possible, again, as we're now talking about the end of the second Beit HaMikdash, the inner act remained. That is how sacrifice turned into prayer. What had once been two different forms of worship now became one. Prayer took on the highly structured character of the sacrificial service, with fixed text and times. The silence that had accompanied the sacrifice was transmuted into speech. Two traditions, prophetic prayer on the one hand, priestly sacrificial service on the other, merged and became one. That is the remarkable story behind the words, "What is the sacrificial service of the heart? This is prayer." Okay, and so Rabbi Sachs, in beautiful language, describes how this was much more, as opposed to the Rambam, who seemed to assume it was like a one-time. Ezra came and he established it. This was something that developed over a number of years. It began in Galut. It then continued as Ezra and Nehemiah came back to rebuild the second Beit HaMikdash and saw the need for a text, and it even continued towards the end of the destruction of towards the end of the second Beit HaMikdash, when there was no longer korbanot, and therefore we needed a much more rigid way to express ourselves, and that's how Tefilah adopted, at least according to Rabbi Sachs, the rigidity of korbanot. But there's one other element to this that I want to point out to you, which again, we're not, because of time, we're going to go a little bit quickly. I apologize. Rabbi Schwab in source number 10, we're not going to see it all inside, but he points out there's another major difference. Something else occurred during these years that resulted in the need for a set text for Tefilah, and that is the end of Nevuah, the end of prophecy. The end of Nevuah ended really during the times of the second Beit HaMikdash. Some say that Ezra was the last Navi. There's machlokas whether Ezra was Malachi or he was somebody else. But certainly during these years, Nevuah and prophecy as we know it ended. As a result of that, suggests Rabbi Shimon Schwab, there was a need for a set text, because before that, the preponderancy of prophecy amongst the Jewish people meant people were able to express themselves more easily. Even regular people achieved, according to Rabbi Schwab, a certain level of prophecy. And therefore, they were more able to express themselves properly. Once Nevuah was removed from the picture, it became a lot harder for Jewish people to express themselves in the proper way. And therefore, we no longer had the ability to daven, and we needed, says Rabbi Schwab, the text of Tefilah. Okay, so we have really three different approaches to why Anshe Knesset HaGedolah established the set text. One was, according to the Rambam, was Galus caused a mixture of languages, a confusion. People couldn't speak anymore. They didn't know how to talk, and therefore Chazal needed to establish a set text to make sure that they would continue to daven. According to Rabbi Sachs, it was kind of developed more over a longer period of time, a combination of necessity and Galus versus new realities in the second Beit HaMikdash, and the eventual destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash and the end of Korbanot that caused Korbanot and Tefilah to merge into one, into what we know as Avodah, with the rigidity of Korbanot now being imposed upon Tefilah. And the third, as Rabbi Schwab describes, was the end of prophecy. The end of prophecy caused a disruption within our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and necessitated us creating a text so that all of Am Yisrael could properly express themselves. Which now brings us to today. Nowadays, the question that we could all ask, and this is a question that was raised before, is we all know that there is an inherent challenge in having a set text. And that challenge is that very often we come to davening and we say the same thing 3 times a day. It causes us to get used to it. We say it by rote. We no longer think about it. Many of us don't feel that we properly understand the text of the Tefilah, and therefore, if I'm davening with this in a language that isn't necessarily natural to me, and even those who speak Hebrew, the language of biblical language is not always so easy for them. So on the one, it becomes hard, it becomes rigid, and I don't understand what I'm saying, and therefore, what is the purpose here? So obviously, we have to first, before we even answer that question, we have to really understand and realize and understand the value of what we're saying and why it's still important that even to this day, we have a set text. Number one, and this is what the Rambam was highlighting, I think it's all clear to all of us. If there was no set text, and even nowadays, each of us davened what we wanted when we wanted, when would we daven? When we were in distress, when we were in pain. What are the chances that each of us would daven every single day for 10, 15, 20 minutes? We might start, and then after a week, it's the same thing over again. I don't have much to add. I said it all yesterday, God. What else do I need to say today? The chances of us properly maintaining a set, real, honest tefillah on a daily basis 3 times a day or 2 times a day or whatever we're able to maintain is much less. And so clearly Chazal had the intuition to realize that if we want to keep tefillah as a forefront and as a major part of our Avodat Hashem, it needs to have a set text. That needs to be the base. That needs to be a part of what we have. I would take it even more than that and suggest that part of what Chazal are teaching us, and this is hinted at a number of different sources, that Chazal are reminding us what we should be davening for. We learn from the Shmona Esrei what our focus should be. Because if all we were doing was davening for ourselves, what we wanted to say, we would all be thinking about our own personal challenges. One person would be thinking about, let's say someone has a relative that's going through an illness, or another person's going through parnasa, or this person's struggling. We all have our own personal struggles, and those are important things to talk about. We'll get to that. There is place for personal tefillah. But what would we fail to talk about? We probably would forget to say Slach Lanu Avinu Ki Chatanu. We probably would forget to talk about Ga'al Yisrael. What are the chances we'd be talking about Yerushalayim Ircha Barachamim Tashuv if we were all just davening ourselves and developing our own text? And so what Chazal have done is it's really a lesson in priorities. Chazal are teaching us that every single day, when you daven to Hashem, part of that tefillah should be Salach Lanu Avinu Ki Chatanu. I'm not perfect. It's not just about God, give me X, Y, and Z. It's about God, please help me become the person I want to be. Atah chonen la'adam da'at. You're the person who's the source of all knowledge. Please give me the wisdom. As opposed to saying, God, give me X, it's God, give me the wisdom to make the right decisions. And so what Chazal have established for us is that, by the way, it's not just on a personal level, on a national level. Tikah b'shofar gadol l'cheirusenu. These are things we should all be thinking about, but because of the vicissitudes of life, we wouldn't be. And so what Chazal have done in establishing this text, and the Rambam hints it when he says that these are all the avot of requests, is Chazal are saying, reminding us, these are the things you should be davening for. These are the things you should be thinking about. These are the things that should be important to you and part of your daily life. And so having a set text is so much more than just, giving us the ability to talk. It's teaching us lessons about life. There's so much more to say. I'm sorry, just one second, just because of time. If you look at the source number 11, we're not going to see this inside, but 2 other approaches that I want to suggest to the importance of a set text. The Rav Chaim Volozhin in his Sefer Ruach Chaim is a commentary on Pirkei Avot. Rav Chaim Volozhin points out, and this is something that I think many of us have faced, he discusses this on a mystical level. He says, when we talk about the power of these tefillot, we have to remember that these tefillot were written by Nevi'im, which means that there is a power to every single word in these tefillot that we don't fully appreciate. This is something that Rav Chaim Volozhin talks about all over. This is very much his Weltanschauung in general about the power of Torah Lishma, and learning Torah creates spiritual realities that we don't understand. The same thing is Tefilah. Tefilah, the text of Shemona Esrei is not just stam. Some rabbi got up and wrote a few words. These are texts that are imbued with a certain level of Kedusha, created by the last of the prophets that we had in the Jewish people. And therefore, there is a unique power to those words that even if we don't fully appreciate it. And says Rav Chaim Volozhin, the tefillah that I say today is going to be different than the tefillah that I say tomorrow, because it is imbued with a special mystical power that we not fully appreciate. And it's something that we should remember, that these are not just words, these are words that are established by the great leaders of our Jewish history. And the last thing I would point out, and this is something that's highlighted by the last couple of sources, is that when we daven, we tap into the totality of the Jewish people and Jewish history. The text of our Tefilah, Rabbi Sachs writes it at the very end in source number 13, Rabbi Donin in source number 12. When we daven, we're not just saying words. We're saying words that, number one, are built off of psukim and stories and the history of the Jewish people throughout the ages. We're also saying the same exact text with a few variations that they're saying in Morocco, that they're saying in they're saying in Russia, that they're saying across the world in Australia. And therefore, why is it that we can walk into any tefillah wherever we are and usually follow? Well, okay, it's true that there are variations. Sfard, Teimani, there are variations, but fundamentally the text is the same. And then when we daven, we're not just davening, we're davening as part of the Jewish people. We're davening as part of the entire Jewish community all over the world, davening the tefillot that the Jews have said for thousands and thousands of years, and there's a certain power to that. There's a certain koach to that. And so, yes, is it hard? Do we not always understand what we're saying? Do we perhaps find maybe it can be a little bit tedious? And it could be, and feels a little bit like too repetitive. Yes, but on the other hand, if we think about it, what we're doing is we're tapping into something greater than ourselves. And what I want to end with is next week we're going to actually focus on the personal part of tefillah, because none of what we're saying today is meant to exclude the fact that Chazal did institute within the tefillot numerous opportunities for a person to also have the opportunity to add in his personal tefillot, either during Shemona Esrei or outside of Shemona Esrei. Meaning this is just one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that building off of everything that we have here, building off of the Kedushah of the text, and building off of tapping into the Jewish people, or reminding ourselves of the values of what Chazal want us to think about, there are built in, or certainly numerous opportunities that not everyone is aware of, that are opportunities for us to create our own personalized tefillot within that text. And that's something that we'll hopefully spend time next week. I apologize I didn't take questions, but I wanted to make sure to finish. Everyone have a great week.